Okie dokie. All of that stuff out of the way, let's start with this tutorial. So, it's telling us that if a firm decides to produce more of a product, so the key bit here, oh, I haven't got that turned on, that's why that's not working. So the key bit here is more. So it's not saying it's just deciding to produce a product, it's deciding to produce more of a product. What would its opportunity cost be? So can you please type into the chat A, B, C or D? So which one do you think is its opportunity cost? No, you don't have tutorials for 2 weeks after this. So next week's reading week, so you don't have tutorial, and then week 7 you've got a test, so you don't have tutorial either. So you won't see me until week 8. So the firm's producing more of a product. What would its opportunity cost be? Bearing in mind it's the thing that's essentially giving up. So what is it giving up to be able to produce more of this product? Type in the chat A, B, C or D. You've got 25% chance of getting this right. One person, come on, there's 16 of you. Actually, probably 15 if I take myself out. Okay, so we need to say to ourselves, how do we measure how much it essentially costs us to make an extra unit? And we were covering something like this in last tutorial. I mean, it wasn't to do with cost, but it was to do with marginal utility, wasn't it? So marginal cost here, what is marginal cost? What does it mean, marginal cost? Additional cost to produce an additional unit. Perfect. So if you didn't know that, then please put that down on your little definitions page. Put marginal cost and put that down. Brilliant. So this is essentially how much extra it's costing us to go on to produce more of this product. So that's why D is the right answer. Now C is a common one. I've had it in all the tutorials I've taught for this. Loads of people have gone for C, so I get why you're going for it. But it's the idea that they're producing more of this product. So we just need to know essentially what extra it's costing them. So that's why the answer is D. Lovely. Okie dokie. The money they've spent, basically, would be the opportunity cost in this. That's what they've foregone. So opportunity cost can be monetary, but it can also be other things. So if you can't put like a monetary value on things because they haven't essentially spent money, that's when we start talking about that they've given up their time, for example. Okay, question 2 then. So question 2, you were given this table, let me zoom out ever so slightly, and you have to fill it in. So before we crack on with filling this in, we've got average cost here. Can someone remind me what an average is? So it doesn't have to be related to this question, but how would we find an average? If I gave you a set of numbers, how would you find their average? Add them all together and divide by the amount of numbers you have. Fantastic. So let's now apply this to the question. Does anyone think they know how you find average cost? So what we're going to do is going to add all of our costs together and divide them by how many there are. How can we put that in terms of words that we have in this table? If you add all your costs together, what have you got? What have you essentially got? And it's something that we've got in this table. Good, perfect. So average cost is your total cost divided by your output, because if you add all your costs together, you've essentially got your total costs. That makes sense, right? And you're dividing by how many there are. Well, how many there are is how much you're making, and that's your output. So your average cost is your total cost divided by output. So I would probably be inclined, if you didn't know that, to put that on your little formula sheet. So average cost is equal to total cost divided by output. Now, don't panic. If you didn't know that, there's another way you could have figured this out. Always look to see what they give you in the table. And there's a reason why they've put a line here rather than expecting you to fill it in. And the reason why is because it means that for some reason this can't be calculated. Well, that makes sense if I do this divided by this, because I can't divide by 0. So that's why that one isn't an option to fill in. So if you didn't know this, you could start to think to yourself, well, how would I ever get to that point? Well, if I divide by 0, that would be why. Okay, in which case then, let's just fill a couple of these in. Can someone tell me what the answer to this one here would be? Perfect, 85, love it. And what about this one here? We won't do them all because once you get the hang of it, yeah, good, 55. Perfect, okay. So I'm going to assume that you can go and fill in the rest of those. The solutions do get posted at the end of the week if you need to check. Okay, marginal costs then. So it might not be obvious on here, but if you download the Word document, it becomes very obvious that actually this line here is sitting in between here. So it's not on the same level of any of these, it's always in between. And the reason why is due to the definition. Your marginal cost is how much extra it's costing you to produce an extra output. So it's that change from your previous output to the new output. And it's the change in your cost. So what's the change in the cost that gives us the marginal cost here? What would your change in your cost be? I'm going to put delta. What's your change in your cost? 30, lovely. If you just do 85 minus 55, you get your marginal cost. Let's just do one more. What about this one then? So it's now the change from output 2 to output 1. What's the change in our cost? How much more is that costing us? Perfect, 25, thank you. Okie dokie. So we've got these. We just need to think about total cost now. Well, we can see total cost over here. We said that average cost is equal to total cost divided by output. If I rearrange that to get total cost equals, or total cost as subject of the formula, what does that become? How can I rearrange that to get total cost equals? AC times output, fantastic. So that's how you're going to figure out the blanks in here, because you've got your output and you're going to have your average cost. Okay, in which case then, what would the total cost be for this blank here? Fabulous, 160. Let's just do. Is it going to let me write 160? Yep. And what about this one here? We'll just do a couple, and then I'll assume that you can go and do the rest. Fabulous, thank you. 210, lovely. So that's how you'd go and fill that table out. So make sure you can understand that and go and do that, because it's quite a common kind of question to ask. Lovely. Okay, let's move on. So the next part then says to us, let me just zoom in, how much is total fixed cost? So before we start answering these questions, could someone tell me what the difference is, or maybe just define for me what a fixed cost is, or tell me what the difference is between a fixed cost and a variable cost? And also maybe give me an example of one. Could anyone tell me what the difference is, or maybe define fixed cost for me, and then give me an example of one? Remains the same regardless for output, fantastic, and rent. Yeah, rent's a common example, lovely, because it's the idea that let's say that you were, I don't know, selling something. Well, let's say you'd bought a shop to do that. Your rent that you pay the person to essentially occupy that shop doesn't change depending on how much you sell. So it doesn't change depending on your output. Lovely, okay. So let's quickly go back to the table just to get an idea. So we want to know for an output of 0. So what would fixed cost be for an output of 0? What's the fixed cost here? 0 is always a good one to look at anyway when you're trying to figure out fixed cost. Yeah, lovely, 55, perfect. In which case then, what would the answer be for II? And I'm not going to flick back because we don't need to. By definition of fixed cost, I don't need to look back. What must it be for an output of 6? Yeah, good. They're trying to trick you up there by changing the output. But if you know what your definition is, you'd know that the fixed cost isn't changing. Okie dokie. Then it's saying, well, I want to know what the average fixed cost is. Now, does your average fixed cost depend on your output? Does your average fixed cost change on your output? Yes, it does. Okay, so how do we figure that out then? How do we figure out our average fixed cost? So let's do it for an output of 5. How would we do that? Divide by 5. Perfect. So we're taking our fixed cost, which we know because we've already figured out what that is, and you're going to divide by 5. Good, so can then someone tell me what my average fixed cost is for an output of 10? Brilliant, yep. Fantastic. Okie dokie. D, how much is total variable cost at an output of 5? So instead of me flicking back, what I'm going to tell you, I know we figured it out anyway, what I'm going to tell you was that total cost for an output of 5 was 210. So that's what I'm going to tell you. It's on the table though, because you figured it out. So how much is total variable cost at an output of 5? I'm loving the answers. Can you, in case anyone's stuck, can you explain how you got there? What did you do? You did. Perfect. So total cost, if you ever want it on your little formula sheet, can also be fixed costs plus variable costs. Well, if you know your total cost is 210 and we know our fixed cost is 55, then we just subtract them to find our variable costs, which is what they've done. Lovely. Let me just write that out in case anyone is confused. Perfect. In which case then, can someone tell me what the answer is? Oh, it is slightly different anyway. How would we figure out the average variable cost at an output of 10? How would we figure out the average variable cost at an output of 10? Or does someone tell me what the total variable cost would be to start with? What would the variable cost be to start with? And then we can figure out the average. I need to probably tell you what the total cost is actually. I'm not making life very easy for you. So the total cost is 760. So could someone tell me what the variable cost would be? $705, good, because you did 760, take away 55, lovely. Now we just need to bring in this average word. So average is dividing by how many there are. How many does the question say we're making? Yeah, perfect, divide by 10, lovely. So if you do 705 divided by 10, you should get £70.50 for that. Lovely. So hopefully that makes sense. If not, then please do drop me an email and I'll happily spend more time explaining that. Okay. Next question then. So what we're supposed to do then, with all of that data, we were supposed to go and plot the graph. So I'm hoping that you guys have gone and plotted these in your own time anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what it should have looked like plotted, and then we're going to have a little chat about them. So this is what it should have looked like plotted. So I'll leave that on the screen for a little bit for us, if you have a little think about that. Okay, and then the question says, can you mark on the diagram the output at which diminishing returns would set in? So the output at which diminishing returns would set in. So it's kind of giving it away here because I've marked it for you, but does someone want to maybe explain why here is the output at which diminishing returns sets in? Why do I think that X is round about there? What's increasing? Yeah, good. So this, in maths speak, I would call this a turning point. This is the point at which marginal cost goes from falling to rising. It's our turning point. Perfect. So the point at which your marginal cost essentially changes direction is the point at which diminishing return sets in. Lovely. Okay, so then H. So H, what H was wanting at first, it was wanting us to be at the point where average cost was greater than marginal cost. So the first thing I'm going to ask is where on this diagram does average cost equal marginal cost? Where on this diagram does average cost equal marginal cost? The intersection, fantastic. Oh, someone's drawn it, thank you, cool. So, do I need to be to the left of it or to the right of it for average cost to be greater than marginal cost? Do I need to be to the left of it or to the right of it for average cost to be greater than marginal cost? The left, perfect. So if anyone's wondering why, just look for the point when average cost is higher. So let me add to that nice yellow line someone drew. And here is when average cost is greater than marginal cost. Similarly then, on this side here, average cost must be less than marginal cost, or marginal cost must be greater than average cost. Okay, so the question is saying we are operating at some point in this region here. And then it's given us a few things and it's telling us to pick which one is true. So A says, well, an increase in output must raise average costs still further above marginal cost. So what that's saying is it's saying, well, as output increases, average cost remains higher than marginal cost. Is that true? If I'm starting over here and I keep increasing our output, does average cost always stay above marginal cost? Does it? So I start somewhere here. On the left, yeah, but it doesn't say I have to stay there. It just says I keep increasing output. At least that's how I took the question. Yeah, okay, fine. Lovely. So in my eyes, it couldn't be A because at some point average cost does fall below marginal cost. Okay, B, a reduction in output would raise average cost. So we're starting at this left-hand side of this dotted line and we're going to reduce output. So we're going to move this way. Do we find that average cost gets raised? Does average cost increase if we go further to the left? Yeah, we do. Perfect. So I would have said, in that case, B's the answer, B's true. Let's just quickly go through the others just to make sure we haven't, made a silly mistake. So C, the firm is producing beyond its minimum average cost level. So on this diagram, it's a little bit hard to see, but I would probably be inclined to say that the minimum for the average cost is around about here, right? So if we are producing in this region here, then we're not producing beyond it because we haven't gone past that. So I would be inclined to say that C is also not true. So that's why it can't be C. D, the marginal cost curve must be downward sloping at the current level of output. So on this point, to the left of this dotted line, do we find that marginal cost is always downward sloping? So to the left of that dotted line, do we find that marginal cost is always downward sloping? No, perfect, we don't, because what we see is it's downward sloping here, but it also rises here, and that's a possibility because it doesn't tell us quite where we're producing to the left of this line. And then lastly, E, average fixed cost must be constant. Why does it never make sense for an average fixed cost to be constant? Why does it not make sense? What's happening when we do an average? What are we dividing by when we find an average? Output, perfect, and output changes, right? So even though fixed cost, in this question it was 55, as soon as we change our output, this number overall changes, and then that makes no sense for us to be able to say that average fixed cost must be constant. Lovely, okay, so that gives us sort of, confidence that B will correct with our answer of B. Lovely, let's move on. Okay, so there are a few missing, and there was it goes up to H. But if you can match these up, then we know easily work out the rest. Let me zoom in once more. There we go. So, any ideas? You don't have to do it in order, but if you tell me the letter and you tell me the Roman numeral you think some of them match up to, we can start filling this in. Anyone got any ideas? Maybe I'll put F, G, and H here. And maybe before we start, actually, does anyone understand what, does anyone know what's meant by the problem of indivisibilities? Or if not, could they give me a great example of one? Does anyone know, has anyone heard that before, the problem of indivisibilities? Okay, so I'm going to give you an example and then maybe you can see if you can apply it to this question. So, I overcome the problem of indivisibilities in everyday life when it comes to washing my clothes. So what I do is I wait until I can put a full machine wash of clothes on, rather than just putting a couple in, washing that, and then having to do like another wash the next day. I wait until I've got a full load to put on, rather than just sort of doing multiple washes here and there. The reason why is because it costs me to run the washing machine, so I would rather be paying for it to run once with a full load rather than running multiple times. So I'm essentially being efficient here. Where do we think that relates to the examples we've been given? Yeah, it does. Perfect. A. So an easy one to probably do, I mean, actually, I think some of these are easier, but they've cut off the screen, unfortunately. Bulk discount. What does it mean if you bulk buy? What does it mean if you bulk buy? Yeah, but what's the special thing if you buy lots at a time? What tends to happen? Yeah, good. The price goes down. Okay, so which one of these is starting to talk about getting things at a lower price? Yeah, I. Perfect. So if I buy lots of them, bearing in mind I'm going to need all of these inputs at some point, I might as well buy them at a lower price. I can obtain my inputs at a lower price. Lovely. Okay, what about D then? D is quite a classic economics thing. So workers spend less time having to train for a wide variety of different tasks and less time moving from task to task. It's this idea they can really focus on one task rather than having to do loads of different things. Where do we think that fits in? I, perfect. So this idea of specialisation and division of labour you're going to hear lots about in an economics degree. Okie dokie. So we've got quite a few of them going on here. So what ones are these? Quite easy. Okay, diversify. So let's put this in different terms. Maybe some of you have heard about buying stocks and shares. And when people sort of do this, they want what's called a diversified portfolio. Why do they do this? Why do they want a diversified portfolio? What are they doing? What are they mitigating against? Risk. Lovely. That is exactly what they're doing. They're mitigating against risk. So which one of these is talking about risks? Yep, lovely. So it's the idea that if one of their markets goes to pot, something happens, there's like some systemic issue, they're not going to suddenly, become bankrupt or lose their business because they've got things in other markets. So they managed to spread their risks. Lovely. It can more easily make a public issue of shares. It can more easily make a public issues of shares. Why do people give out shares normally? Why do you find companies give out shares or issue out shares? What are they doing that for? To raise funds. Perfect. Yeah. Brilliant. So which one of these is sort of getting at that? So raising funds. Which one's kind of getting at that? V. Perfect. Yeah. So it's all this idea about obtaining finance. Lovely. Okay, F, G and H then. So F, what was F about? It uses large warehouses to store its raw materials and finished goods. So which one do we think F is getting at? Or maybe we should do G first. I really like G. So a clothing manufacturer does a deal to supply a soft toy manufacturer with offcuts for stuffing toys. So what that's saying is it's saying that it's making its clothes and it has all of its offcuts, which is essentially waste, right? But it's managed to find another use for them. Which one of these gets into the idea of finding another use for products and managing to make money out of it? VI, yeah, perfect. It becomes economical to sell byproducts. Lovely. What else have we got going on here? So conveyor belts, this is H, conveyor belts transfer the product through several stages of the manufacturing process. So conveyor belts transfer the product through several stages of the manufacturing process. Bearing in mind, we've only got two left to pick from, so what have we got? We've got F. And so we've got this to choose from. Oh, why does it do that sometimes? Sorry. We've got this to choose from and this to choose from. So which one do we think goes with F and which one do we think goes with H? I agree with you. VII is this idea that production can take place. Yep, cool. And then in which case here. So make sure you get those down. I think the easiest way to attempt this question was to do the easier one first and then sort of just use a bit of common sense to figure out the last ones. Lovely. Let's move on. Okay, so what have we got going on here? So if you downloaded this tutorial sheet right off the beginning, you would have found there was a different question in here. There was an extra one. We've taken it out because there was a mistake. So in which case, we're moving on to this one now. So what you've been given is you've been given the total cost and the total revenue curves for a firm. And you're just asked to start off with at what output is the firm's profit maximised. So before we get into this, can someone tell me or someone remind me, what was the formula for profit? How do we calculate profit? Total revenue minus total cost. And you know what? That's really good news because we've been given a graph that has total revenue on it and it has total cost in it. So in order to maximise profit, it kind of makes sense that I want this difference between these two numbers to be as big as I possibly can make it. So I want the gap or the difference between these two numbers to be as big as possible. But if I start looking at the gap between these two curves, I need it to be as big as possible. So at what output level is the gap between these two curves as big as possible? Roughly. Well, actually, it's not roughly. It's quite easy to read off this one. 40. Yeah, perfect. So if you're looking here, it looks as if the gap between these two is as big as possible. Now, sometimes people get confused and they say, well, why have I not picked the gap here? Well, the problem is here is total cost is greater than total revenue, so I wouldn't be making a profit, I'd make a loss. So it has to be this bit here. Okay, how much profit is made at this output? So how much profit is made at this output? So you need to tell me what the total revenue is, you need to tell me what the total cost is, and then you need to subtract them. So how much profit is made? So what's the total revenue to start with then? What's the total revenue at the output of 40? What's the total revenue? Yep, and what's the total cost, roughly? Yeah, 32, 33, whatever. Yeah, because you're just reading off there. I think if you've actually got the Word document, I think if you click on it, it tells you the coordinate, but that's fine. Okay, so then we're going to subtract them. So what's the profit? 7, lovely, perfect. Okie dokie, what does it ask next then? So C is asking us to draw in the profit curve, but only for positive profit. So the easiest way to do this first is at what points would profit be 0? Where would profit be 0 on this graph? The intersections, yeah, lovely. So here and here, profit would be 0. So that's always very easy starting points because I know if I'm drawing my profit curve, I'm going to do a 0. I'm going to draw across here and across here because profit has to be 0. And then we can use what we figured out earlier on. We already figured out that at 40, profit is 7. So where there's 40, I'm going to roughly do a cross at 7. So let's say that's roughly 7. And in which case then, it's literally just joining them up. No, not quite 51, no. Yeah, but I get what you meant, don't worry. So we're going to join them up and that's a terrible looking curve. You could do that better than me. But yeah, you're going to roughly have a curve where the maximum is around here because we know that our max is 7. And that would be your profit. Okay, how much is total fixed cost? How much is total fixed cost in this question? So this is D. How much is total fixed cost? It is 10. Where did you get that from? Where did you read that off to get 10? Yeah, so always a nice little trick. If you ever want to figure out what fixed cost is, always look what your total cost is at an output of 0. Lovely. Okay, E then. At what output is the price elasticity of demand equal to -1? So this is either a rule that you know or you don't know. So when does price elasticity of demand equal -1? What has to hold true for price elasticity of demand equal -1? Something to do with these curves. So I think it's mentioned in Sloman, but if you haven't read it, then you're just not going to know. Okay, so -1 is something that's known as unitary elasticity. Actually, close. 70 is not, yeah, it's not bad. Why did you go for that? What did you look at to get? So well, the question is, at what output is price elasticity of demand equal to -1? Yeah, good. So it's when total revenue is at a maximum. So when total revenue is at a maximum. So roughly around here. So kind of 70. I mean, I went just slightly below it, but yeah, fine, I get you. So just a little bit of a side note then into this, in case any of you really liked maths and you did a bit of calculus at school. If not, don't worry. You just need to be able to write down the fundamentals of this. So it's when total revenue is at a maximum. Well, marginal revenue is always total revenue differentiated. It's always the case. Marginal revenue is always total revenue differentiated. So if total revenue is at a maximum at this point, what must hold true is that marginal revenue equals 0. So for those of you who've done a lot of calculus, this will make sense. For those of you that haven't, don't worry. All that you need to write down to yourself is a little note to say that when PED is -1, it must be that total revenue is at a maximum and marginal revenue equals 0. So make sure you write that down. So total revenue at a maximum and marginal revenue equals 0 for PED to equal -1. Okay, last bit of this part of the question then. F, it says, at what outputs does the firm break even? What does it mean if you break even? Yeah, good. Total cost equals total revenue. Or profit is 0, either way. So profit 0 or total cost equals total revenue. And we kind of already covered this earlier. We looked at these intersections. So if you just read off where this happens. So, I don't know, 20 and 50, 21, 20, 21 and about 56. There you've got your outputs at which the firm break even. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. The solutions go up at the end of the week if you need to spend a little bit more time looking at this. But once you get your head around these graphs, they're really not too bad. Okay, let's move on then. So, what we've got now is we've got another whole table going on. And you're meant to graph them. I will just show you the graph. But let's have a little think first. So, what we tend to find that people rush into getting things graphed and they haven't had to think about what they should look like beforehand, and then they start to make mistakes. So let's just have a quick think about what we'd expect these graphs to look like. So bearing in mind, on our y-axis we have cost and revenues, and on our x-axis we have quantities. If we look at our average revenue numbers, what would I expect the line for average revenue to look like? Looking at those numbers, what would I expect the line for average revenue to look like? Good, I'd expect it to be horizontal because it's not changing when output changes. Lovely. And then the same thing would hold true. Not only would it hold true for marginal revenue, it'd actually be the exact same line because the numbers are the same. Lovely. Let's have a little move over to marginal cost then. So what's happening here? Well, what's happening at the beginning? Is marginal cost falling or increasing? So is it decreasing or increasing? Right at the very beginning, is it decreasing or increasing? It's decreasing, but then straight after that, it starts to rise, doesn't it? So I could say to myself, well, what I would expect roughly is I'd expect a graph that goes down for a very short period of time, and then it would go up. So I expect my marginal cost curve to have this kind of shape. So if I end up plotting something and it doesn't look like this, I know I've made a mistake. And then we've got a similar story going on for average cost, apart from it falls for a fair bit longer. So it falls for a fair bit longer before rising. So I'd expect them to have these kind of shapes. And this is always good practice to get into, so you know what shapes you're expecting when you're plotting, because it helps to spot any errors. Okay, let me show you what these need to look like then, and then we'll have a little chat about them. So this is what I'd expect them to look like. This is what, if you were to plot these, hopefully you would get that to look like. And B wants us to have a little chat about the shape of the average revenue curve. So we've already established it's the horizontal, but what I want to get into is I want to get into it a little bit more. So average revenue, how do I calculate average revenue again? What do I have to do to calculate average revenue? Total revenue divided by output, fantastic. Can I take this one step further? How do I figure out total revenue? What do I have to do to figure out total revenue? Price times quantity, lovely. Now I've used the word output here, but output is the same as Q, so I'm going to just replace that with a Q because they're the same thing. What does this simplify to? What's P times Q divided by Q simplify to? P. So average revenue is equal to marginal revenue is actually equal to price. So if you ever see anywhere that this is your demand curve, that's why, because this is equal to price. This is your demand curve. So not only is it horizontal, this is your demand curve, and we can see that price is this set number here. So looking at this then, does this imply that this firm is a price taker or a price setter? Does it imply they're a price taker or a price setter? It does. It implies they're a price taker. Perfect. Because if they were a price setter, it would be able to change, and that's not happening. Lovely. So that's what that question was getting at when it wanted you to really talk about average revenue. And I just thought I'd prove to you as to why average revenue is the same as price. Okie dokie. So what else does it go on about then? So it then says to us, I think the question's now up here. Let me just zoom out ever so slightly. At what output is profit maximised? So at what output is profit maximised? So let's just quickly talk about this again. What did I say profit was again? What was the equation for profit? Yeah, perfect. Now this is where people get confused because they say, well, I can't answer this question because this graph doesn't have total revenue or total cost on it. Now it doesn't need to. So I'm going to tell you the condition because you don't need to know the maths, but for those of you that like maths, I'll also add that in. So this is what profit is. Profit is maximised when marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Now the reason why, if those of you that like maths, if you don't like maths, just make sure you have this down, you know this. The reason why is because marginal revenue is total revenue differentiated, and total marginal cost is total cost differentiated. Well, if I want to find a maximum, I differentiate and set equal to 0. So if I were to differentiate and set equal to 0, I would end up having marginal revenue equaling marginal cost. So that's only for those of you that have already done differentiation and like maths. You do not need to be able to know how to do this in order to answer this question. You just need to remember this condition. So where on this diagram then, at what point does marginal revenue equal marginal cost? A, perfect. And what does it say? What output is that roughly? If you can kind of give me a rough number off of that. What output is that roughly? 560, I'd agree with you. Lovely. Okay. And then in which case, how much is average cost at this output? So for the output of 560, roughly what is average cost? Yeah, so anywhere between 240 and 250. I'm going to go with 240 just because I've seen the Word document and I can click on the coordinate. But yeah, I get you. That's absolutely fine. Okay, E, how much is average profit at this output? Okay, so you said to me that profit is total revenue minus total cost. By default, if I take the average of profit, so if I do a profit, all I'm doing is taking the average of its components. So if I take the average of its components, I must have the average of the overall thing. So average profit must be the same as average revenue minus average cost. And the reason why that's fantastic news is because we have all of those in our diagram. So what was the question? How much is average profit? So what is average profit at this point? Bearing in mind, you've told me what average revenue is. Actually, you haven't. You told me what average cost is, but you can read off what average revenue is and then just subtract them. So you've told me average cost is 240. What was average revenue at 560? What roughly was average revenue? So what's this roughly? Actually, you can use the table. So I keep saying roughly. You don't need to. All the numbers are in the table, aren't they? Because we plotted this. So what was the average revenue always equal to? Yeah, 320. Lovely. Okay, so what's those take away then? What's 320 take away 240? I forget that we had the whole data points for this. What's 320 take away 240? 80. Lovely. 80p. Perfect. So I'm going to put 0.8. Okay, so F, shade in the area representing maximum total profit in the above diagram. So it's already given to you, so I have kind of given the game away here. But have a little think to yourself as to why this is the profit. Have a little think to yourself about why this is the profit. Have a think to yourself about, well, how do I figure out total revenue? Well, total revenue is price times quantity. Ooh. And we're saying that we're producing at, why is it? Stop. Let me try and delete that. Is it going to let me? It's going to delete everything, isn't it? No, okay, cool. Sorry, I went a bit weird. So, if total revenue is price times quantity, well, I know that I'm producing at the quantity of 560, and I've already proved to you that the average revenue is your price curve. So I know that this is price times quantity, but I need to also subtract my costs, and that's when we're at the average cost curve. So that's the reason that this rectangle here is the area for profit. So can anyone figure that out for me, or can they at least tell me the sum that we would need to do to figure out the area of this rectangle? Bearing in mind, you've just worked out for me that this is 0.8. So what would the area of that rectangle be? So if the width of that is 0.8, what's the length of that rectangle? Yeah, good. Okay, so you did 0.8 times by 560, which you've successfully told me is 448. Lovely, perfect. And then H, what is the lowest price the firm could receive if it were to not make a loss? So I don't particularly like looking at this in order to answer that question. I would probably go back to the table. So the lowest cost they could receive. So this is the idea of what they could charge people. So they're no longer going to charge them $320. What's the lowest they could charge to them? Well, if I'm not to make a loss, I need to cover my costs. So I need to think to myself, well, what is the lowest cost that I can produce at? And I need to look at my average cost table, and I can see that, well, I can produce 500 units with an average cost of $230. So if I were to charge them $230 for 500 units, I wouldn't make a loss, but that's the absolute lowest I could charge them without making a loss. Hopefully that makes sense. So just look to see an average cost as a minimum, and that's the absolute lowest that I could charge them, because then I'm covering my costs. Okay, last question then, and I will let you get on with the rest of your day. So 6, what could shift the average revenue curve for a price-making firm to the right? Bearing in mind, what did we just say about the average revenue curve? What did we say average revenue is equal to? What did we say average revenue was equal to? What did I prove to you it was equal to? Price, good. And in which case, that tells us this must be the demand curve. So anything that shifts the demand curve to the right must also shift my average revenue curve, okay? And the key word is shift here. I want to shift, not a movement along. So can we start thinking of some ideas that would shift our demand curve? Because then that would result in shifting this. What would shift our demand curve? What things have we spoke about in tutorial 1 that shifts our demand curve? Well, that's what we're getting at. We're trying to think what does change demand. So what would change demand? What would shift it? Income. Okay, let's start with income. So what would have to happen to income for demand to increase? Would it have to rise or would it have to fall? Good, so we have an increase in household income. That's one of the options. Okay, so you said a competitor lowers their price. If that's... Well, that would make my demand for my product. It depends, actually, doesn't it? So when we talk about other goods, there was 2 things. There were substitute goods and complementary goods. Let's start with the idea of a substitute good. What would I need to happen to the price of a substitute good in order for people to come and demand my good? rise. Perfect. I would need the price of a substitute. Oh no, I think I just read an old answer and thought it was this. Let me get rid of that. What would I need to happen to the price of a substitute good in order to increase the demand for my good? Yeah, increase, thanks. I kind of get that away, but hey ho. Good, so if substitute goods increase, then people would come to my product instead. What about if it was a complementary good? What do I need to happen to the price of a complementary good? So complementary is the idea that you buy them together, you buy them in tandem. What do I need to happen to a complementary good? What happens to price? Good, price needs to fall. So there are 3 options. There's one more thing that I would quite like us to get at. So in last tutorial, we had a whole question on it. And I said that firms spend a lot of money doing this because it increases demand. Ads, perfect. Advertising. So advertising or marketing. So if they were to increase advertising or marketing, it is likely that it would increase demand and it would shift the average revenue curve for a price-making firm to the right. So there are all the possible options that would happen for this. Lovely. So I hope that makes sense. If you've got any issues, then please do get in touch with me, and also try and make use of the discussion board that's on Canvas. So you haven't got a tutorial with me for a good couple of weeks now because you've got reading week next week and you've got a test in week 7. Please do some work. It would be lovely to see you all doing very, very well. Thank you so much for coming. Go and have a good rest of your day.